A lot of talk in the run-up to the general election this year has been about the relative success of Farage's Reform UK party, and the impact that this is having on the Conservatives. Ever since the return of Farage, we've seen Reform's polling steadily increase, with some polls even starting to put Reform ahead of the Tories in the past couple of weeks. However, in the last week or so, we've seen evidence of Reform's polling starting to decline. With us now so close to polling day, and with very limited time to turn things around, this could be really bad news for Nigel Farage, and incredibly welcome news for Sunak. So in this video, we're going to take a look at this polling decline, having a look at how significant this is, how it could come about, and what this could mean for both Reform UK and the Tories on voting day. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. Now, it's worth starting this video by taking a look at where Reform UK were prior to this slight decline. When the election was first called, Reform were hovering at around 10% in the polls, significantly lower than the Conservatives, roughly 23%. Now, this was to be expected. Reform were a relatively new party, and their star, Nigel Farage, had opted to not take part in the general election campaign, instead saying that he'd spend his time and effort aiding the re-election of former US President Donald Trump. However, only a few days later, Farage U-turned and stated that he would in fact take part in the campaign as the leader of Reform UK, while also saying that he would stand to be an MP in the seaside constituency of Clacton. Following this, Reform underwent a huge rise in support, with polls generally starting to hover at around the 15% mark. From here, their support only rose further, with Reform's post-Farage polling bounce coinciding with the deterioration in the Conservatives' already fairly weak campaign. For instance, Sunak's decision specifically not to stay for the entirety of the D-Day commemorations was particularly devastating, and something that almost certainly helped to encourage right-wing voters over to Reform UK. Now, the result of all of this was that Farage's Reform UK party rose so much in the polls that most of them put them roughly equal to the Conservatives. Obviously, there was some variation here. Some polls put them a couple of points clear of the Conservatives, while others put the Conservatives slightly ahead. But in the aggregate, Reform UK and the Tories were roughly level. This week, though, we've started to see something of a decline in Reform UK's polling. For instance, the latest More in Common polling reported a 1-point decline for Reform UK versus their previous poll, as has YouGov. More concerning for Farage, though, BMG Research and People polling have reported a relatively significant 3-point decline compared to their previous polls, and Redfield and Wilton have seen an even more significant 4-point drop. Now, there are actually a couple of reasons for Reform's polling decline here. The first is Farage's recent comments on Vladimir Putin. Now, Nigel Farage has been more sympathetic towards Putin for some time now, with him saying back in 2014 that Putin is the world leader he admires most. While he did clarify that he admired him as an operator, but not as a human being, this is still a questionable statement, given that it was made in the same month that Putin illegally annexed Crimea. But if this was just a comment that he made a few decades ago, there's a good chance that voters might simply gloss over it, apologize for it, and move on. However, when Farage was questioned not only about this comment, but also about other comments on Russia, specifically a comment he made in 2022 in which he blamed the West for Putin's invasion, he had this to say.
When Vladimir Putin sent his troops across the border in 22, you blamed the West, not him. You said, I'll just read it to you and then you can react, that on a tweet, it was a consequence of EU and NATO expansion. Is that a judgment you stand by?
Right. I'll tell you what you don't know. I stood up in the European Parliament in 2014 and I said, and I quote, there will be a war in Ukraine. Why did I say that? It was obvious to me that the ever eastward expansion of NATO and the European Union was giving this man a reason to his Russian people to say they're coming for us again and to go to war.
But you were echoing him.
Sorry?
You were echoing him. That's what Putin says.
No. Sorry, I've been saying this actually since the 1990s. Ever since the fall of the wall. But hang on a second. We've provoked this war. It's, of course it's his fault. He's used what
But
we've done
we
as an
provoked
excuse.
the invasion of
Yes,
Ukraine.
and very interestingly, once again, 10 years ago when I predicted this, by the way, I'm the only person in British politics that predicted what would happen. And of course, everyone said I was a pariah for daring to suggest it. George Robertson, former Labour cabinet minister, who went on to become the Secretary General of NATO, has in the last couple of weeks said the war is a direct result of EU expansionism.
But I'm asking you about, because it's your judgment, you want to be Prime Minister. Let me ask you about someone else.
My judgment has been way ahead of everybody else's in understanding this.
Now, it's worth pointing out that when the war in Ukraine began, it was Boris Johnson who rushed to provide aid to the embattled President Zelensky, something that was praised by both his colleagues in the House of Commons and the right-wing press as one of his greatest achievements as Prime Minister. In fact, those on the right of UK politics tend to have a very strong opinion of the British military, and a particularly positive opinion of the UK's stance against Nazi aggression in the Second World War. In fact, it was this view that ultimately damaged Sunak when he opted to leave the D-Day commemorations early, as it was seen by those across the political spectrum, but particularly by those on the right, as a disrespect to those who fought a hostile European aggressor. Similarly, Farage is now being undone by his statements on Putin, with those on the right likening his comments to the policy of appeasement pre-World War II. In the same way that Boris Johnson got praise for his Churchillian style in his support for Ukraine, Farage has now been criticised by the right for his Chamberlain-style comments on Putin. For example, in a letter to the Telegraph editor last week, a reader explained that as a disillusioned Conservative voter, I had decided that this time I would support Reform UK. Then I read about Nigel Farage's suggestion that the West is responsible for the war in Ukraine. This brought me back to earth. Similarly, in another letter, a different reader explained that Ukraine is an independent sovereign country existing within internationally recognized borders. Its application to join NATO was largely the result of its discovery in 2014 that bullies do not recognize neutrality. So it's clear that the Putin issue is still having cut through and will likely continue to hurt Reform UK all the way up till voting day. But that's not the only problem. The second issue that's caused a decline in Reform polling is the ever-increasing number of campaigners and Reform candidates that have been caught making inappropriate or offensive comments. Now, we won't list them all here, but it's at least worth briefly discussing how ineffective Farage has been at shutting all of this down. The most egregious example of this was when Farage was asked on Loose Women about a Reform UK campaigner who made homophobic comments.
One of them is a senior Reform UK campaigner who's well established within the party, and he was actually the one who made the homophobic comments.
Yeah, they'd watched England play football, they were in the pub, they were drunk, it was crass,
but I get
it was
drunk.
vulgar.
I don't,
No,
I'm not homophobic when I'm drunk.
Well, people when they're drunk often turn quite nasty. Look,
similarly, in the very same TV appearance, Farage started claiming that it was possible that Channel 4 or a production company working for Channel 4 paid someone who was campaigning for Reform UK to make racially offensive comments about Rishi Sunak. Not only is this seriously implausible, but it fails to demonstrate any contrition or accountability as leader of the party for situations like this arising. Overall, his response to both situations wasn't strong enough to shut the issue down, and we've seen even more reports this week of problematic comments from people allied with Reform UK. The question now, though, is with so little time until polling day, will Farage be able to turn things around and maintain his polling high, or will we continue to see a decline? Ultimately, we'll find out on Thursday when the election results begin to come in. And if you want to see our live reaction to those results and interact with our team live, then you should join us for our official election night live stream. If you want access to that stream, then you'll have to pick up a copy of Too Long, our 60-page, high-quality magazine full of TLDR's very best journalism. This issue is focused on the UK election, diving deep into the campaign, the results, and how the winners plan to fix Britain. It's more than just Britain, though, with stories including the European parliamentary elections, the countries likely to join the EU next, the latest from Gaza, the rise of Milei, and, of course, the US election. Now, we've decided to make the magazine for two reasons. Firstly, it allows our journalists to write in more detail, diving deeper and ignoring algorithmic restrictions to produce the best work we can. And secondly, it's a good way for you to support TLDR and will help us to produce free YouTube videos as long as we can. If you're interested, then you can pick up a copy from our website, where we're selling 2 editions of the magazine. Firstly, there's the standard edition, and then there's the premium edition, which gets your name printed in the thank you section of the magazine, access to our behind the scenes podcast, and exclusive access to our election night live stream, where we'll be reacting to the exit poll with you as it happens. Oh, and by the way, we're going to be making an issue of Too Long every 4 months. So if you want to ensure that you never miss an issue, then you can subscribe, which gets you a 25% discount. If you have more questions, there's a full Q&A linked in the description, where you'll also find a link to our store. And while you're there, make sure you use the code ELECTIONWEEK to get an additional £2 off any purchase. Thanks so much for hearing me out, and if you are interested, please do pick up a copy, as it's a great way to support our journalism and help us to continue making free YouTube videos as long as we can.